to the What If It's Not Depression Vodcast. I'm your host, Dr. Achina Stein, and today I have a very special guest on my show. His name is Dr. Titus Chiu. We were just talking about how to pronounce his name. I've known him for quite some time and I never actually knew how to say his last name, but it's Chiu, and he says he should have been a dentist.
A holistic dentist.
A holistic dentist, of course. So just so you know, he is a #1 best-selling author and an award-winning international speaker. And he is a chiropractor by trade, but is specializing in functional neurology. And he specifically specializes even within functional neurology in post-concussion syndrome. And that is what we're going to talk about today. If you like this episode, please subscribe and click the like button. So I want to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Chiu. He helps high achievers go from surviving to thriving after concussion by empowering them with the most up-to-date tools and resources needed to take control of their brain. Dr. Chiu works with patients and private clients from all over the world, both online and in person, at his Integrative Brain Center in California. Welcome, Dr. Chiu.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stein. So good to be here with you.
Yes. And I think you like to actually be called Dr. Titus, or people call you Dr. T. So
Dr. T, Dr. Chiu, all the same to me.
Right. So I love your story, and I always tell people, or ask people, I should say, is that, to talk about how they became a specialist in their area. And I always find that it's always a very personal story that got them into doing the work that they are now doing, and find that is their, sort of becomes their superpowers, sort of, because it's something that they've lived, breathed, and done on a day-to-day basis. So tell us about what happened to you.
Sure. Yeah. So over 20 years ago, I was in a really bad car accident that nearly took my life. And I was driving to work one day on my scooter, and I got hit by a car, and I flew like 10 feet, hit the ground. And I'm so glad that I was wearing a helmet, because otherwise we would not be having this conversation.
Wow.
And so I ended up breaking 3 ribs. I dislocated my shoulder, and I suffered a concussion. And so thankfully I survived that accident. But fast forward many years later, I was struggling with the symptoms of concussion and post-concussion syndrome. So I tried everything, within conventional medicine to get answers to my chronic pain and my vertigo and my brain fog. And I came up empty-handed. So I decided to go outside the box, which is part of my personality. And I went back to school. Actually, I got a postdoc in clinical neurology. I did a master's in nutrition. I studied chiropractic, acupuncture. I went, poured through research papers, conferences, anything I could get my hands on to really crack the code and figure out what was going on and what I can do to help myself heal. And so I'm so glad that I did, because along the way, that whole journey through school, everything that I learned, I applied to my own health, and I experimented with my own brain, and I was able to heal from my concussion. And I feel so blessed. Excuse me. One of the darkest times in my life, really, it turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because I was able to share that information with thousands of patients and clients throughout the world, really, and help them on their journeys as well.
Right. Wow. I'm so glad, because the world absolutely needs you, to do this work. I've had a few patients with post-concussive syndrome in combination with PTSD or anxiety. And so definitely see them getting better over time, but it would be great for you to share some tools. But before we start with that, I'd love for you to explain to our listeners about what is the difference between a concussion and post-concussion.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a concussion is actually the jolt to the head, right? The injury. And the interesting thing about that, right, is concussions, most people think you need a physical blow to the head, like an actual hard hit to the head, or you need to be knocked out or lose consciousness. And that's frankly not true. You can have you can sustain a concussion if you're in a car accident and you have whiplash, you don't even hit your head on anything.
Right,
I've
right.
even had patients after a roller coaster ride, they come off, right? And they're like, yeah, ever since I took that roller coaster ride, I've had all these symptoms. I've had patients who are riding a bike and they fall and they land on their shoulder. They don't hit their head at all. And the same thing. So concussion is that physical injury to the brain, but again, to create that distinction, not necessarily to the head. And that's why I think so many people fall through the cracks of conventional medicine, number one, or honestly, sometimes different alternative medicine routes as well, because they don't even realize that one of the biggest triggers and stressors that led to their chronic illness was from a head injury, right? A concussion.
Right.
Because it was so minor and they just didn't think about it. So yeah, to answer your question, concussion is that initial injury. What post-concussion syndrome is the symptoms that perpetuate after that initial injury, months or even years, in my case, from that original concussion, the quote unquote concussion, right? So there's a lot we can unpack there as to why that happens. The good news, at least what we read about in the research, right? The majority of people, I think I read a statistic recently, 90% of people who have a concussion, right, a head injury or a brain injury, they recover, right? 90%, so high percentage. But there's the unlucky 10%, like myself, right, who don't, and they fall through the cracks of conventional medicine and they develop post-concussion syndrome. So these symptoms like brain fog, or I've worked with patients with anxiety and depression from a concussion. I've worked with patients with vertigo or dizziness. You name it, I've seen it all. And we can talk about why that's the case, why so many different symptoms can be triggered about that later. Yeah, but for now, just to create that distinction, concussion is like that initial injury. Right. And again, it doesn't even have to be an injury to your skull, right? That's the initial injury. And post-concussion syndrome is a constellation of different symptoms due to an unmanaged or untreated concussion.
Yeah, before we dive into the next part of it, I would love for you to just rattle off all the different symptoms, even symptoms that people wouldn't necessarily think of that would be connected to concussion and become post-concussive.
Absolutely. So literally, we could be sitting here talking about virtually any symptom, honestly, and I'll tell you why in a second. But I like to categorize it into physical, mental, and emotional, right? So there's the physical symptoms that you can have after a concussion, which are things like dizziness, headaches. You're going to have sleep issues. So the more physical ones, maybe like, what are the physical ones going to think of? Yeah, dizziness, headaches. People have light and sound sensitivity. Talked about vertigo. So those are common physical symptoms after a concussion.
What about tinnitus?
Yeah, that's a very common one as well, for sure. Right. The ringing in the ears.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there with ringing in the ears and what people are starting to think, the latest research into that. And rather than it being an inner ear problem, many times it's actually a perceptual brain issue. But yeah, so physical symptoms like that. And then we have...
Do you see gut symptoms as well?
Yeah, exactly.
Symptoms? Yeah.
Gut symptoms. That's what I was saying. It's like there's digestive symptoms. I've seen patients who, after their head injury or their concussion, they develop autoimmunity, right? It was after their autoimmunity or after their concussion, they developed autoimmunity, because there's research that looks at, I've seen this both in the research literature, but also clinically, that a person, like they did this study on rats, actually, right? Or mice, I think. And they found that the mice, they had, before their head injuries, they had totally healthy guts, right? When we talk about the health of the gut, we talk about that microvilli and the small intestine, right? All the, all the different areas, totally healthy. Like you can, for listeners out there, imagine like a shag rug, right? Really like fluffy shag rug, like the really healthy digestive system. And after a concussion, literally within hours, and then this continued for days afterwards and weeks even, that shag rug became like Berber. It was like completely bare. And so that the digestive system just got completely annihilated, not from a food sensitivity, not from a bacterial pathogen, right? But from a head injury. So yeah, you're right. So I've seen chronic, stubborn cases of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. I've seen leaky gut. And then, as you know, and I'm sure many of your listeners know, once the gut goes south,
Right.
that opens the floodgates for all different types of, physical illnesses, as well as mental and emotional. So that's what I was saying earlier. I've seen all kinds of symptoms triggered by a concussion. So those are the physical ones, but then there's the mental ones. So things like brain fog and brain fatigue and cognitive challenges, maybe like memory issues or having trouble. I see people, a lot of times they have trouble focusing, right? Maybe they are pretty good at focusing and they can, prior to their concussion, they can sit and work for hours. And then after their concussion, they're just like, wow, I just can't focus at all.
Right.
So those are examples of mental symptoms. And so we have physical, mental, and then there's the emotional ones, right? Things like anxiety, things like depression, things like just feeling chronically stressed. So, and again, the reason why we see so much is really, it's because of the different regions of the brain that are impacted in the concussion. And so it's post-concussion syndrome is a very complex disorder, and there's no one size fits all approach to it. There's no cookie cutter approach. And that's one of the reasons why I see, honestly, a lot of patients falling through the cracks, unfortunately.
Right. And I think balance is, I don't know if you mentioned balance, but balance kind of hits two of those categories, right?
Absolutely. Balance. Yeah, you got it. I see a lot of balance issues because either damage to this area called the cerebellum or the vestibular system. And one thing I've seen a lot, I think you might find this interesting. I see a lot of patients, even patients without concussion, who have anxiety, right?
Yes.
And they've tried medications, they've tried changing their diet, they've tried talk therapy even, right? And it didn't touch it, or maybe it helped a little bit. And they'd end up coming to my clinic or working with me virtually. I'd do an exam and I'd find that their balance was totally off, right? And then identified one of the root causes for their anxiety was their inner ear, like imbalances in the vestibular system. By the way, the vestibular system's a part of our nervous system, for those of you out there who don't know, that helps us balance, right? And it gives us a sense of what we call proprioception, body awareness. And so when the vestibular system is out of balance itself, we can have trouble with balance, but it can be so subtle that it's not like when you're walking around, you're stumbling and falling over. It could be when you close your eyes, then you feel wobbly, or you try balancing on one foot and you're like, oh my goodness. I have so many patients, I can't tell you. When I do these tests, they're like, oh, my balance is fine. And I'm like, okay, we'll see about that.
Exactly. I mean,
they close their eyes and they start wobbling. They're like, oh my goodness, I had no idea. Anyways, I've seen that very common. Obviously, as you know, anxiety could be due to a lot of different root causes, but I found, at least in my practice, being a functional neurologist specializing in this stuff, imbalances in the vestibular system are a common root cause. And the reason why that's important is because depending on what the root cause is, then you have the particular treatment or intervention, right? And so no medication will touch an inner ear imbalance. If the person's left semicircular canal is, working less than their right, there's no medication that will bring that back to balance, but there are things that you can do. And we can talk about that in a bit. Right. So to answer your question, I have seen that a lot. It's very common balance issues, and I love how you said it's kind of falls into some of these categories more than one, because I've seen it lead to emotional. Do you see that in your office too, as well? Like imbalances in the vestibular system?
Yes, I do. I mean, I do a full physical exam on many of my patients, incorporated that as part of my intake. And so including a neurological exam. And so I see a lot of balance issues, and it's always a surprise for people. So
right. Isn't it? Because there's ways we can test for it where you pull out these subtleties, like with your eyes closed or balancing on one foot versus the other.
Right. And I mean, but there's multiple variables that cause a person to balance. It's not just the inner ear, it's eye cues and sensory cues. Like you could lose your balance because you have numbness in your feet.
Exactly. So even itself, even balance itself, you have to figure out what the root cause is of that.
Exactly. So many things come together that allow you to be balanced. So so let's dive into why the 10%? What is about the 10% of those people that end up having a post-concussive syndrome?
Yeah, great question. I want to, before I answer that, I actually think it's a much higher percentage, right? I think that, the research looks at a lot, most people quote unquote recover, but what does that mean? And is it fully recovered? Because when we talk about functional neurology, we're looking for the subtleties, right? In conventional medicine, it's kind of like you're either healthy or you're dead. There's no in between. Either you can't get out of bed because your balances are so bad, or you are an Olympic athlete, right? There's nothing in between. And so one of the things in terms of that, like, I think the percentage is a lot higher of people who develop post-concussion symptoms. It's just so subtle, it doesn't really impact their life in a way that they're going to go to a doctor for it, right? But so anyways, I just needed to put that out there. I don't think it's just 10%. So, but in answer to,
I agree with you.
Right? Yeah, you totally get it, because you see things through the nuances of functional, right? Functional medicine. So that being said, though, in terms of that, I think what I figured out, right, this whole post-concussion syndrome, it's due to many things. And like when I was going through it myself and experiencing all these symptoms, I didn't understand it at the time, right? But I dove deep into the world specifically of concussion, right? Not only did I study neurology and all these other things that I described, but I really dove into the world of concussion, post-concussion syndrome. And what ends up happening after a concussion, and again, just to review, whether it's a physical blow to the head or even just a jostling, like a jolt to the body, after that concussion, after that physical insult, that trauma, there is a secondary chemical trauma. Because what ends up happening inside our brain, we have these immune cells, as you know, called microglia cells. And we also have astrocytes, these glial cells that make up 90% of our brain tissue, actually, right? The other 10% is actually the neurons that create the telephone connections, but the remaining 90% are involved in things like immune function and detoxification and triggering a healing response or triggering a inflammatory response, right? So anyway,
the housekeepers.
Exactly, the housekeeper. I like to call them the nurturers, right? The nurturers of our brain. Like clean up after all these workers,
Exactly.
like their telephone connections and whatnot, making sure those connections are, efficient and they're optimized. And so anyways, after the physical insult, you have this chemical trauma, right? Where these glial cells, they become activated. And from, normally when the brain's healthy, there these, like you were saying, there's these housekeepers, I like to call the nurturers of our nervous system. But then when there's, boom, some type of trauma, then those guys change their expression and they become warriors. Right. No longer are they just kind of crawling around, sweeping things up, vacuuming. They're like, there's something going on, something very wrong in the brain, and we need to put it out, right? And so they launch a massive inflammatory reaction that could then lead to, like, as long as that inflammatory reaction, by the way, as you know, inflammation is a normal part of the healing process, right? So, but what ends up happening, you have this massive, what we call neural inflammatory reaction happening in the nervous system. But then those chemicals from the nervous system can be released systemically, meaning throughout the rest of the body. And that's one of the reasons why what we described earlier, a concussion could lead to digestive imbalances, or a concussion can lead to autoimmunity, right? As well as a concussion leading to depression because of this inflammatory response. And depending on where that inflammatory response is happening, then you develop the symptoms, right? So not only do you have that initial insult, right? Then you have the secondary chemical trauma, then it becomes this vicious cycle. So, but in answer to your question, the reason why some people heal from that, and this is from my personal experience, as well as professionally working with patients for over 15 years and also pouring through the research, is because something was going on at the time of their injury, right? I've seen this time and time again. Either they're going through an extremely stressful time, or maybe they lived in a house that had mold, or maybe they already had a food sensitivity, right? Because what ends up happening when you have that physical trauma, this protective covering we call the blood-brain barrier becomes breached, right? So we're talking about the brain and the 90% of the cells and the 10%. So that's all the brain tissues, right, in the cells. But protecting that organ, like for those of you out there, if you just imagine what a brain looks like, right, that's all the cells and the communication and all the housekeeping we were talking about. That all happens there, right? But then surrounding that, you have this thin tissue we call the blood-brain barrier that protects the brain from that. So when you have a physical trauma, that blood-brain barrier you get these little micro tears. And then what ends up happening, things that were already floating around in the person's body. So let's say, for example, they had a sensitivity to gluten, right?
Right.
All of a sudden, when you have a tear in that blood-brain barrier, then that gluten not only causes digestive symptoms, now it can enter the nervous system and the antibodies associated with it and trigger massive inflammation, right? I can't tell you how many times I've worked with patients and I'm like, yeah, I think we need to get rid of gluten because, based on my assessment and these tests, it says you have a gluten sensitivity. They're like, what? I've never had issues with gluten before. Right. I used to eat it all the time. Maybe I'd have some digestive issues, but it never triggered brain fog or depression or anxiety.
Right.
But then the reason why is because, again, after that micro tear to the blood-brain barrier, that inflammatory reaction that was protected from your brain, right, from the gluten, that might have been impacting your gut, maybe possibly your thyroid, which is very common, right? What ends up happening, it could then enter the nervous system and lead to brain symptoms, physical, chemical, mental, or emotional, right? So anyways, that's why I think post-concussion syndrome happens, right? It really depends on the state of the person's brain health at the time of the trauma, the level of inflammation. And that was for me, right? Because at the time I had that original head injury 20 years ago, I was definitely not living the healthiest lifestyle, right? I didn't know anything about diet or lifestyle. And to tell you the truth, I couldn't care less, really. I was like in my 20s and just enjoying life. But looking back now, it made perfect sense. It was like the perfect storm. And then that injury, and then I didn't know anything about that. So that's why I had to go back to school. And all the doctors I went to, they didn't know about the blood-brain barrier. Maybe they heard about it in school. They didn't know how to address it. They didn't know how to heal it. They didn't know how to retrain the brain, right? The vestibular system. So that's what I think happens to so many people, right? That fall through the cracks of conventional medicine is, number one, most people after a concussion, they just kind of look at that injury as the thing. What I do with all my patients and clients, I literally go back to sometimes, right, what was the health of your parents at the time of conception, or, how was your mom's pregnancy and the delivery? As you know, it's like the entire history. When a person shows up to my office or when a person has a concussion, there's an entire history of things happening before that injury or at the time of the injury that then leads to things like post-concussion syndrome.
Exactly. Yeah. It's usually, two or three things that come together that create a perfect storm.
Perfect storm. Exactly.
And then, but there's always things that were happening before that.
Yeah, exactly.
There's always some history, and it is a matter of digging that up because that's part of finding the root causes. Yeah. So the primary reason, so what you're saying is the primary reason people have a longer time recovering it from a concussion and having post-concussive syndrome is because of this immune activation or reactivation of sorts, that it's almost like a cytokine storm.
Oh yeah, in the brain, right? Exactly. Yeah, and it can spill out into the body. Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, so, and I see it's like this, I love how you said reactivation, because we call that the activation of these microglial cells, right? When these nurturers get activated into the warrior, that's part of the natural healing response. The problem is when it gets stuck in the on position, and then that leads to chronic neuroinflammation, like a chronic fire smoldering in your home, right? So that's the thing, right? But the good news is, right, there's things we can do, right? Evidence-based things we can do to shift those warriors back towards the nurturers and then help facilitate the healing process.
So before we go into that, can you explain why does the brain have to do that? Why do those glial cells have to shift from nurturer to warrior? What's the purpose?
Yeah. So the purpose, like I said before, it's to trigger a healing response. So just like if you get a paper cut, right? You get a paper cut on your finger, your nervous system sends signals to your immune system that then triggers this cascade of, hormonal, like not hormonal, humoral, meaning bloodborne impacts, as well as neurological reflexes.
Right.
And what's the purpose of that? To facilitate healing. So these white blood cells come into the area to clean up the debris, and then you get swelling, the rubor of inflammation.
Right.
And that's to help facilitate healing. Like I said, though, the problem is if those nurturers get stuck in the state, right, in the neuroinflammatory response, and they get stuck in the on position as the warrior, then those cleaners coming in to, take care of your home, and then they send in the SWAT team, and then the military comes, sure, the fire's put out and the invaders are booted from your home, but you're left with a skeleton of a home, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the thing, right? A lot of patients, just to finish here, a lot of patients I see, or even before that head injury, they already had a little fire, maybe in their basement or in their kitchen or something, that they're like, this is manageable. But after that head injury, then boom, the whole house goes on fire sometimes.
Got it. Yeah. Sometimes, analogies are really helpful, but I think, there's this in-between phase. A warrior to means, for me anyways, is this aggressor, like I'm going to war. So if I can put a little phase in between that, it's like the mama is the nurturer that then becomes the grizzly bear mama.
Exactly.
Activating to save her child, right? And then it becomes a warrior because she's just doesn't know how to turn herself off, and she's just killing everything.
But that's, that's needed, right? In those moments, you'll need to save your child. Absolutely. And then when the threat is dissipated, right, then it's like, okay, go back to the nurturer. If the mama bear comes home to carry the little baby bears and she's still a warrior, that that can lead to chaos in the home, right? Exactly. So that's the key, is it's about that balance, right? And it's this really complex interplay between the brain, right, the neurological systems, the nervous system, and the immune system, right? And then we can bring in the hormonal system, the endocrine system. There's this whole beautiful dance and communication happening when things are healthy, right? But when the communication starts to go south and it's muffled between the nervous system, between the immune system, that's when it leads to things like chronic inflammation and post-concussion syndrome. And that's why a lot of people, that end up coming to my clinic, they've been through the ringer. They've been to doctors, they've been to specialists, they've maybe tried things on their own, like listening to podcasts, right? And reading blogs and trying this and that. but it's like there's something missing still. And it's
Right.
because there's this deeper picture of these root causes underneath the surface that need to be addressed. But the beautiful thing is, right, as you've seen this, right, personally as well as professionally, once you can identify what those root causes are for you as an individual, then there's so much we can do through the what we call neuroplasticity to begin the healing process.
Right, right. So what are some of the things that people can start doing or even thinking about at this point on their own and in investigating, aside from working with you, at some point coming to work with you? But, so you talked about like the 3 pillars of brain health and how that is related to concussion recovery. Well, why don't you start with that, what those 3 pillars are, and maybe do a little dive into some details about that.
Absolutely. So the 3 pillars of brain health is this framework that I discovered over 20 years healing my brain and, working with patients and actually teaching other doctors. And so what I've discovered to really have optimal brain health, right, and mental and emotional well-being, we need to have the 3 pillars of brain health, which are the physical brain, the chemical brain, and the emotional brain. And so those 3 pillars need to be intact in order to, what I've seen, fully recover from a concussion. And what the physical brain is, it's what we discussed earlier, right? The 90% cells that we call the glial cells, as well as the 10% we call the neurons. Those are the brain cells that make up the bulk of your nervous system, right? And so that's what I call the physical brain. And those neurons in particular, that 10% we talked about, they communicate with one another and they allow us to experience things. So there's an area of our brain we call the temporal lobe, right? And the temporal lobe allows us to listen to this vodcast right now, right? There's an area that we call the occipital lobe, and it allows us, if people are watching video, right, that allows us to see this video.
Right.
And there's areas that we call the prefrontal cortex that allows us to focus on this conversation. Right. So those are the physical structures of the brain that make up what I call the physical brain and allow us all these amazing experiences, right? And when those areas communicate with one another, it's what we call neural networks, right?
So it's like the hard drive. It's like the hard drive and the software of your
computer. Exactly. And I love that analogy. And it's also those neural networks are able to communicate. Like if you imagine the brain and these cells, they're tiny. They're able, though, to communicate across vast distances relative to the size of their size, right? Their brain cells. So it's like me and you. We're able to communicate across the country from California to Rhode Island via the internet. We're creating a little neural network hub right now, right? And so that's similar to how the brain works. It's what we call neural networks, these communication pathways. But the thing is, when you have a concussion, some of those areas become underactive and the communication in other areas become overactive, leading to symptoms like anxiety or leading to things like depression, right? As you've probably seen, research shows that a lot of people who experience the symptom, quote unquote, symptom of depression, they have decreased activation of their left frontal lobe, right? This area of the brain right behind our forehead. But the beautiful thing is once we understand that, there's things we can do to start retraining those areas. So yeah, that's the physical pillar of brain health. And again, the reason why that's important to understand, there's a specific way of healing the physical brain that's different from, let's say, the chemical or the emotional brain. Right. So that's the first pillar of brain health, the physical. The second is the chemical. And that looks at things like the nutrients. It looks at things more the glial cells we talked about, the inflammation response. It looks at things like hormones and blood sugar balance, mitochondrial function, as well as toxins. So all those things create a neurochemical milieu that our physical brain exists in. So I love to use the analogy of the soil, right? So it's like the physical brain's like the roots of a tree, right? So imagine the physical brain, you have these physical roots, right? That if they're strong, then that tree is going to be strong. And then you have the strong branches that make up the physical structure of the tree, right? But then you have the soil that the roots have to then, dig themselves into, that's the chemical brain, right?
Right.
So you have all these brain cells floating around, right, in what we call cerebral spinal fluid. And with that, it's like the soil, all the nutrients, as well as toxins and other, offenders and triggers. So the chemical brain, aka the soil, needs to be healthy as well. So imbalances in blood sugar, high levels of inflammation, everything we talked about a second ago, that can really impact a person's recovery from concussion. So that's the second pillar of brain health, is the chemical. Mm-hmm. And finally, the third pillar is the emotional, right? And that's our mindset. It's our beliefs about ourselves and the ability to, our ability to heal, right? I can't tell, I've been, majority, and I'm sure you're the same, 95% of the patients I've worked with over the years, they have chronic health challenges, right? And so even beliefs about their ability to heal, sometimes that can be an obstacle in the healing journey, as well as, so the emotional brain refers to beliefs, mindset, but also stress management, right? And our actual rituals that we've built into our lives. So believe it or not, right, all those things can really impact our brain health, as well as the ability to heal from a concussion. So yeah, those are the three pillars of brain health: the physical, chemical, and emotional. And again, the reason why that's important, because the physical, chemical, and emotional have different things that they respond to. So for example, the physical brain responds to things like brain training, like specific exercises or treatments to trigger neuroplasticity. I'll give a few examples in a second. Whereas the chemical brain responds to things like medications or diet changes or supplements, nutrients, right? And the emotional brain obviously responds to things like mindset shifts, as well as like lifestyle wellness rituals that you build into your life. So all those things are really important. They go hand in hand, right? But the reason why that framework is important, again, it's not just a philosophical or theoretical framework. It's very pragmatic,
Right. There's
and
things
so when
we can do.
yeah, there's things we can do. And so what I do for my clients and patients, once I identify which of those areas are the biggest weak link, then we can focus our energy. Because yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've had patients come to my office and they're like, I've tried the diet change, I've tried supplements, I'm eating like a twig of broccoli and dried chicken breasts, I've been doing it for 10 years and not getting better. Right. What's going on? I'm like, well, most likely you've just been putting all your energy in the chemical brain, right? And that's not your fault. It's what you were told, right? For whatever reason. And so I think if we focus on your physical brain, right, and start to reconnect these pathways with these specific brain training exercises, that's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck, so to speak. And sure enough, when we start to do some things to activate and trigger neuroplasticity in the brainstem and the vagus nerve, as an example, which we can talk about, that's when they start to heal, right? And so that's what I find, this framework, physical, chemical, emotional, it helps me to kind of sift through all the craziness, all the noise from symptoms and different potential root causes. And I'm just like, you know what? We need to focus on the physical brain, because you've done so much in the emotional, you've done so much in the chemical, you've changed your diet, you're trying these meditation practices, lifestyle rituals. So something's still missing. And I think it's this, right? Or it might be the flip. Someone might have, after a concussion, they're like, yeah, I've tried physical therapy. I've tried seeing a chiropractor and it feels better, but still I have brain fog and brain fatigue still. I'm still feeling anxious. And I'm like, you know what? I think you have a gut infection, right? Because of your bloating and this and that. And this is why it's impacting your brain's ability to heal, right? And so we do things like look at, stool testing. We look at nutraceuticals and diet changes. So it's completely personalized. But again, the reason why it's important is because there's a specific type of treatment or at-home thing a person can do that's personalized for which of the pillars is the weakest link.
And I think it's important to say, and I do the same thing. I have a different format as you do, but it's important to also understand that one of those categories can also affect the other.
It's all connected.
It's
Absolutely.
all connected. So it's important to know that it's all connected. Like, for example, I had a patient who had an early childhood trauma who then had a concussion 10 years later. And what keeps coming up are her concussion symptoms because it reactivated her fears around the original,
that makes so much sense.
harm. So she gets activated constantly in brain post-concussive symptoms, but it's directly connected to her being in fight flight.
Yes.
From her emotional trauma.
Exactly. Yeah. You nailed it on the head. It's totally connected. And just like what we were talking about earlier with balance, right? Someone can have anxiety from a physical, right? A physical brain issue, AKA like the vestibular system or the sensory system, like we talked about, that could then lead to an emotional symptom or vice versa, right? Where childhood trauma, and I work with a lot of patients when I do history, I wouldn't say probably about 70% of my patients, when I take a history, they have some type of emotional trauma that happened. But again, it makes sense from the science too, because emotional stress can lead to damage of the blood-brain barrier, believe it or not, right?
And
it can lead to inflammation.
Right, and the gut barrier too. It can cause
Exactly.
gut permeability due to the connection with the vagus nerve.
Yeah.
So what are let's do a little deeper dive into like, what are some specific interventions? You did talk about brain retraining a little bit. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So one of the first things I look at, and you said it too, is like, I think we see, we have very similar experiences as clinicians, right? One of the biggest things I see that is an obstacle to healing from a concussion is that fight or flight response, right? Because after a trauma, whether it's emotional, like you said, or a physical trauma, like in the case of concussion, the nervous system can get stuck in the state of fight or flight. But when let's unpack that a little bit, right? So when I say that, what I'm talking about is there's this neural network, and just to review, it's that communication hub that's related to the autonomic nervous system, right? The autonomic nervous system is the balance between sympathetic, right, fight or flight, or parasympathetic, rest, digest, and heal. And so one of the key structures of this communication hub is what we call the brain stem, okay? And the brain stem sits in between your brain and your spinal cord. And the brain stem's in charge of things like our blood pressure, our heart rate. It's in charge of gut motility. It's in charge of releasing digestive enzymes, right? All these automatic, aka autonomic functions that are happening right now as we're sitting here behind the scenes. It's all happening, right? And
breathing
it's due in part. What's that?
Breathing as well.
Breathing and reproduction, sleep wake cycle. It's just a bunch of functions that keep us alive, really. At the end of the day, the brainstem is all about survival, right? And so what I've seen in my practice, when people get stuck in this state of fight or flight after a trauma, right, you have this structure we call the brainstem, which is, right, phylogenetically as well as evolutionarily one of the oldest structures. We call this a reptilian brain, right? Like reptiles have the same structure, this brainstem. So it's all about survival, right? But then, as we develop as human beings from like a little infant to a toddler and, adolescent, so on and so forth to adult, we have this other structure we call the prefrontal cortex, right, that we talked about earlier, right behind our forehead, that begins to develop, right? And the research shows, and my experience as well, the prefrontal cortex typically develops faster and earlier in women than men, right? And so that's the reason why, it's a generalization, but in general, women tend to have a lot more discernment earlier than guys do, right? So I'm 45, I'm still learning. But that being said, blame it on the prefrontal cortex. Anyways, my point is the prefrontal cortex is also related to our higher selves. The ability, like I said, to have discernment, the ability to have presence and patience and to reflect on things, right? I can't tell you how many patients I've worked with who are struggling after a concussion, right? And they're just stuck in that stress mode. And then,
Mhm.
their doctor's just like, oh, you just need to relax. It's just like, what does that even mean? And then maybe the doctor is like, oh, you need to meditate. Okay, thank you for that. That's practical. But guess what?
Right.
What do you need to be working to have meditation work for you? The
Exactly.
prefrontal cortex,
Yeah.
right? So
There's a
meaning,
pre-meditation phase here.
yeah, right. The prefrontal cortex is what does the heavy lifting when we sit down and try to meditate and calm our emotions. Well, guess what? After a concussion, one of the most common areas to go south is the prefrontal cortex. And so it's kind of like telling someone who doesn't have the ability to sit still to just sit still and meditate and all your problems will go away. No, because guess what? That prefrontal cortex, majority of cases I've seen, it goes south. Guess what ramps up? That brain stem, right? So it's like I talked about earlier, after a concussion, some areas of the nervous system become overactive, some become underactive. One pattern I see time and time again, that prefrontal cortex goes underactive, meaning then you're more easily distractible. You're not as present. And when you try to meditate, it's really difficult and you don't really find much benefit from it. You might feel even more anxious, right?
Worse, yeah.
And yeah, or worse, right?
Right.
But that goes underactive, and then the brainstem, boom, it goes overactive.
Right.
And guess what that leads to? Either higher blood pressure or anxiety or that fight or flight response or insomnia, chronic pain.
Right.
And when you have this ancient survival structure that's been around, again, reptiles and lizards have this structure, and you have this newer structure, right? And newer even in our own development as human beings that develops later on in life, that's more fragile, the prefrontal cortex. Which one of those two you think is going to win in that battle?
Right. The reptilian part of the brain.
Exactly, right? So what I found, rather than starting, well, even when we talk about brain training, people think about meditation, which is a great way of doing it, but that if your prefrontal cortex already has the bandwidth, right? I don't know about you, but majority of the clients I've seen, they're stressed. They're like, their prefrontal cortex are just so fried from years of chronic illness or whatever, like inflammation and stress. So what I found, the most effective way to start shifting that is by taking advantage of the brainstem and activating what we call the vagus nerve, right? So the vagus nerve is actually housed within the brainstem, but in the brainstem is broken up into top, middle, and bottom. The mesencephalon, the pons, and the medulla. And the vagus nerve is housed in what we call the pontomedullary junction. It's the bridge between the middle and the bottom part of the brainstem. Right. So anyways, if you imagine like a 3-story apartment building, the top part is where you get that fight or flight response. And then that middle bottom part is where you get the parasympathetic rest and digest. That's where the vagus nerve is housed, right? Because the vagus nerve, even though it's part of this ancient structure, it actually puts the brakes on that stress response, right? And the cool thing is that there are simple points on your body that can trigger the vagus nerve. Mm-hmm. And one of my favorites is the eyeballs. Mm-hmm. And so I know we have just a few more minutes, but I would love to just go through this really quick demo.
We have time. We have time.
Yeah, I'd love to share this really quick demo for you and for your audience out here. Like I said, there's these access points to the vagus nerve located all throughout your body, right? On your eyes, in your mouth, on your belly, your heart, all over, right? And so my favorite is what's known as the palming exercise, right? The eyeballs is the access point, and the palming exercise is a fantastic way of triggering the vagus nerve, putting the brakes on the stress response. And so the way you do it, so for those of you who are just listening out there, what you'll do is I recommend gently rubbing your palms together. And so I'm doing that right now. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Stein, join me. So gently rubbing your palms together. And I like to, do it so you feel a little bit of warmth, right? And if you don't, that's okay. But if you do, that's that chi, right? That life force energy coming up there. Then what I recommend people do, gently close their eyes and then take the fleshy part of your palms, right? Like the bottom part of your hands, and gently put them over your eyeballs. I absolutely love this exercise. Even when I do it now, I just feel that sense of calm washing over me.
And
And for those of you out there who are listening, just, tune into that. You might not feel that right away, or you might not feel that. That's okay. Just tune into the sensations, or maybe tune into the space that's now created. And I love, especially for those of us who are on Zoom, or on our phones or on TV or social media all the time these days. Oh my goodness, it's such a nice way to create space in your life as well as your nervous system. So just take a few deep breaths in and out. Because when you breathe, you do gentle belly breathing, it's also a fantastic way of activating the vagus nerve, putting the brakes on your stress. And so the pressure on your eyeballs, really gentle pressure. It's as much pressure as you would put on some egg yolks. Really gentle pressure.
That's pressure right on the eyeballs.
Yeah, right on the eyeballs. Just gentle, really gentle pressure. And go ahead, take one more deep breath in and out. And with your eyes still closed, keeping your eyes closed, remove your palms. It's important to keep your eyes closed for this part because you don't want the stress of the light to come in and take you out of that resting, digesting, healing state. And when you're ready, gently open your eyes. Did you do that? What did you think?
I did. It was very calming.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones, right? Because like I said, there's these reflex points when you have, it's what we call the oculocardiac reflex. Actually, there's this disynaptic reflex in your brainstem from your eyeballs to your heart, right? And to the vagus nerve. And when you do that, not only does that help relieve tension in your eyes and mental stress, but it also creates this full body, shifting from that fight or flight to the parasympathetic.
Right. Because we're pressing the reflexes in the hands.
No, it's in the eyes, actually. It's the oculocardiac. Yeah, oculo meaning eyes, right? The oculocardiac. So there's just a built-in reflex we have when we, the funny thing is, I love this. It's like, I love neurology because it helps me make sense of a crazy world, right? So, but if you actually watch, like, what do babies do? And I know I do this myself, right? Before they go to bed, they're like, they rub their eyes. They're shifting their intuitively, right? Isn't that beautiful? They're shifting their nervous system from that, go, 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 into the one of rest and digest as they're getting ready for bed, right? So, through neurology, through understanding, how all this stuff works, then you can use these things intentionally. So I recommend, to my patients and clients throughout the day, if you're on the computer a lot, right? Every 50 minutes or so, set a timer on your clock. When it goes off, take a little break. And one of the best breaks I found, especially if you're on the computer or on screens a lot, is that palming exercise. Yeah. So it's the reflex, it's the pressure on the eyeball that then triggers that response.
Okay. Yeah. For sometimes there are acupressure points in different, not sometimes, there are acupressure points all over your body.
All over the body.
So I was curious to know if we're actually even activating those acupressure points as well. It's like a 2-for-1 kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. You're absolutely right. There's like the whole maps, right? These maps in, Indian medicine as well as Chinese medicine. So yeah, I would imagine that there's an energetic, and it feels good. It's like this little pillow, right? There's a little eye pillow right there.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Perfect. Thank you for sharing that and taking the time to explain that in the way that you did. I love that. And I hope that people in the audience will absolutely try that at home. It sounds like it's very low risk as long as you're gently pressing, right? So before we end, what is some testing that you think people should get if they're not recovering from their concussion? Or what do you think is the most important test or testing that should be done initially?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think testing is just so important, right? Because one of the reasons why my clients and patients get such great success is because we're able to formulate plans based on data, right? So we're not guessing or shooting in the dark with their health. And the cool thing is, like I said earlier about the physical, chemical, and emotional, not only are there different things specific to those different pillars of brain health, there are tests for them. So there are physical tests that we can do to assess what's happening with the physical brain, right? In terms of a neurological exam, looking at balance, looking at eye movements. I find that eye movements are a fantastic window into brain function. In addition to that, there's chemical tests, as many of your audience knows, like stool tests, blood tests, saliva tests. And then even in the emotional world, there's tests we can look at heart rate variability as well as cortisol and all that, windows into the emotional world. But what I found, one of the number one tests I see that people need after a concussion that their doctors don't know about is the test for the blood-brain barrier. It's what I talked about a second ago. The blood-brain barrier is that single cell layer that protects the brain, the physical structure. There's actually a test you can do, a simple blood test that measures the integrity of that blood-brain barrier. Because if that blood-brain barrier, for example, if it was injured after a concussion, and if it hasn't healed, there's virtually, at least in my experience, there's no way a person can fully recover from a concussion. And not only that, research shows that once the blood-brain barrier gets breached, and if it doesn't get repaired, that can lead to things like multiple sclerosis. It can lead to things like chronic traumatic encephalopathy, like Alzheimer's, dementia, right? All these terrible neurological disorders. But the great news is, if you test for it, and even if you found that it was breached, there's things we can do to repair it, right? And really turn the tide. And I'm sure your audience gets this, like things like dementia, they don't happen overnight. They happen after a course of 20, 30 years. So one of the first things that we want to test for to decrease the risk of something like that is the blood-brain barrier. Because if that's breached, if there's a micro tear, that's the first thing we need to do to address and heal that concussion. Because otherwise, again, in my experience, that person won't recover, right? At least fully.
Who provides that test?
So you can get that test through functional doctors, especially if they're trained in and specialize in the brain, right? So that's the thing, like the blood-brain barrier test is super cool because it's like really cutting edge research and technology made available to people today, patients today. Because as you know, there's like this lag in breakthrough discoveries in science and then what's available at your local doctor's office. So that's a lot of what we do, right? Dr. Stein, we like bring those cutting edge things. I know for us, it's kind of like, that's cutting edge. No, it isn't. I've been doing that for the past 15 years every day, but it is, right? It's like the cutting edge we bring to our patients today. So functional neurologists should be able to order these tests and know what to do with it, right? But again, like I found that in my experience, that's not a test that even a lot of functional doctors know about, number one, or know what to do about it. But the good news is there's things that we can do for it if they found that there was some type of breach.
Yeah, that's great. I'm so glad that you shared all that information. That way people can start learning more about it and understanding where they really need to focus their energies. And I love the way that you described the structural, the chemical, and the immune. Right? Did I get that right?
Emotional, yeah. Physical, chemical, emotional. Yeah.
I recorded it in my head as structural, which is physical.
Yeah, no, exact same thing, right? It's the structure of the nervous system.
Right. Yes. Wonderful. So is there anything else that you want to add that you think my audience should know that we haven't talked about that might be really important for them to know that, because I know there's so much we could talk about. We could talk about this forever. And I don't think I think this is everything we've talked about so far has been really, really great. Any last words about what you about what you do and what you'd like to share?
Absolutely. So this is for those of you out there who are struggling with post-concussion syndrome or any type of chronic health challenge, right? Depression, anxiety, no matter what you've been through, there is always hope, right? Healing is possible. As long as you can get to the root cause of what it is for you and put together a plan that's right for you, your brain, and your genetics, there's so much that you can do to turn your health around.
Absolutely. That's great advice and great to give people hope about their health and that they really need to take the time to invest in it, that they can actually live a better and healthier life. I know both of us really know that through experience, and not with only ourselves, but with our patients as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Titus. I really appreciate your time, and good luck to you and your practice. And I hope I'm sure people will benefit from this interview.
Awesome. Thank you. So good to see you.